To the teeming, superstitious masses of the Imperium, the Adeptus Custodes are a golden legend, a myth whispered in the same breath as the Emperor himself. They are seen as a higher form of Space Marine, a more perfect angel of death. This understanding is a profound and fundamental error. The Adeptus Astartes, for all their glory, are soldiers. They are mass-produced weapons forged in their thousands from the flawed clay of humanity, created to conquer the galaxy in the Emperor's name. The Adeptus Custodes are something else entirely. They are not soldiers. They are companions. They were not created to conquer the galaxy, but to stand beside the one who did. Each custodian is not a product of a factory line, but a work of bespoke living art, a process of bioalchemy so complex and resource-intensive that only a handful can be created in a generation. Where an Astartes is given a sliver of the Emperor's genetic legacy, a custodian is sculpted directly from his own sacrosanct DNA. They are not his angels. They are his shadow, his fury, his will. They are in a way that no other being in the galaxy can claim to be extensions of the master of mankind himself. This proximity to perfection is their defining trait and their greatest curse. A custodian is to a space marine as a space marine is to a common man. Their thoughts move with the speed of light, processing tactical data, philosophical quandaries, and artistic theory in the same instant. Their bodies, clad in Baroque Auramite armor, move with a fluid, lethal grace that is breathtaking to behold, each one a master of 1,000 different forms of combat. Their intellects are not those of simple soldiers, but of philosopher kings, each one possessing a mind capable of debating policy with a high lord, commanding a fleet, or composing a sonnet with equal, effortless brilliance. But this perfection creates an unbridgeable chasm between them and the very humanity they are sworn to protect. When a custodian looks upon a normal human, he sees a fragile, fleeting creature, its thoughts slow and simple, its life a flickering candle in the face of their own eternal flame. They are surrounded by the trillions of souls that make up the Imperium, yet they are utterly, irredeemably alone. They are the eternal outsiders, demigods walking amongst mortals, their very nature a constant reminder of the gulf between what humanity is and what it could have been. This profound isolation is but the backdrop to their true central tragedy, a failure so absolute and so singular that it has defined their existence for 10,000 years. They are the greatest bodyguards the galaxy has ever known, beings of unparalleled skill and unwavering loyalty. And they failed in the one duty that truly mattered. At the height of the Horus heresy during the final apocalyptic battle for Terra, they stood guard at the Eternity Gate, the last bastion before the Golden Throne. They were the final line of defense, and they failed. The arch-traitor Horus broke through their ranks and stood before the Emperor, a confrontation that would leave their master a shattered, dying corpse on a psychic life support machine. For 10,000 years since that day, they have stood their silent, eternal vigil around the Golden Throne, the symbol of their shame. Every moment of their existence is an act of atonement for that one catastrophic failure. Every battle they fight, every enemy they slay, is a desperate attempt to wash away a stain that will never fade. They are the perfect guardians of a broken god, the flawless wardens of a ruined kingdom, and their 10,000-year-long scream of failure is the silent beating heart of their sacred duty. In the highest, most rarefied spires of Terra, where the toxic yellow clouds of the lower hives were a distant, forgotten memory, lay the palatial estates of the high-born nobility. Here, in halls of marble and gold, under crystal chandeliers that had once hung in the private chambers of primarchs, the great game of imperial politics was played. In one such estate, that of the ancient and powerful House Amanti, a child was born. He was a perfect infant, the scion of a pure and unbroken lineage that stretched back to the Unification Wars. His future was already written in the stars. He would be educated in the finest schola. He would command armies, He would rule worlds. His parents, Lord and Lady Amanti, looked upon him in his gilded cradle with a fierce, possessive pride. He was their legacy, the continuation of their sacred bloodline. The arrival was unannounced and utterly silent. There was no thunder of a gunship's engines, no grand procession. A single, sleek, black skimmer devoid of any markings or heraldry simply materialized outside the great observation window of the family's private chambers, its anti-gravitic engines making no more sound than a whisper of wind. It hovered there, a void of absolute black against the perpetual twilight of Terra's high-altitude sky, its presence an unspoken and absolute command. Lord Amanti's blood ran cold. He knew, as all of the highest nobility knew, what this silent visitation meant. The doors to his chambers opened not with a sound, but with a silent override of his high-security locks. Two figures entered. They were not clad in the legendary gold armor, but in simple dark robes that could not conceal the sheer inhuman scale and grace of the bodies beneath. Their faces were shadowed, their expressions stern and unreadable, but their eyes held the weight of millennia. One of them stepped forward and presented a simple, unadorned scroll, sealed with the personal sigil of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes himself. Lord Amanti took it with a trembling hand. The script was simple. In the name of the Master of Mankind, it read, "Your house has been found worthy. Your son is called to serve. A great honor is bestowed upon you this day." There was no negotiation. There was no request. It was a statement of fact, a tithe levied not on wealth or resources, but on flesh and blood of the highest quality. Lady Amanti let out a single choked sob, a sound she immediately stifled. To show any grief in the face of such an honor was a form of heresy. She looked at the cradle, at the perfect son, whose future had in an instant been stolen and rewritten. She would never see him take his first steps, never hear him speak his first word, never know the man he would have become. The second robed figure moved to the cradle with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. It lifted the sleeping infant whose entire existence had just been irrevocably appropriated by the throne. The child did not wake. The figures turned, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, and departed as silently as they had come. Lord and Lady Amanti were left alone in their vast, silent chamber, clutching the scroll that proclaimed their great honor. They watched as the black skimmer dissolved back into the smog-choked skies, taking their son, their legacy, and his very name with it, leaving behind only the hollow, echoing glory of their sacrifice. The nameless infant, once the heir of House Amanti, was taken to a place that does not officially exist. A series of hidden laboratories deep in the foundations of the Imperial Palace, known only as the Golden Cells. This was not the stark utilitarian apothecarian of the Space Marines. This was a place of arcane science, an alchemist's workshop on a divine scale. The infant was placed in a nutrient-rich vitae womb, his tiny body floating in a sea of amniotic fluid shot through with shimmering golden nanoparticles. Hooded figures, the genitor artisans of the Emperor, moved with the silent reverence of priests attending a holy relic. Their task was not to implant, but to create. A senior genitor, his face a mass of ancient wizened flesh and humming augmetics, observed the child's vital signs. The Astartes are forged with a hammer, he explained to his acolyte, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. We take flawed material and beat it into a functional, mass-produced shape. But this is different. We do not use a hammer. We use a brush. We do not implant foreign organs. We persuade the flesh cell by cell to become what it was always meant to be. The process was a masterpiece of biological and alchemical horror. The infant was not subjected to the 19 surgical procedures of a space marine. He was subjected to a single, continuous and agonizing process of complete deconstruction and reconstruction at a molecular level. Using technologies lost to the rest of the galaxy, the genitors began to unspool and rewrite his very DNA, using the sacred, impossibly complex genome of the Emperor himself as their template. It was a process of forced, hyper-accelerated evolution, a guided journey from mortal to demigod. For the child, this journey was a universe of pure, unbroken agony. His first sensations of life were not the warmth of a mother's touch or the sound of a lullaby, but the fire of viral phages rewriting his cells, the pain of his own nascent bones dissolving into a liquid state before rehardening into a new auramite-laced composite, and the agony of his muscles being torn apart at a cellular level and rewoven with synthetic golden fibers. His consciousness was forged in this crucible of pain. As a toddler, his world was the inside of the vitae womb, his only companions, the masked faces of the genitors and the constant screaming fire in his own flesh. His body was a battleground. He would be subjected to chemical floods that would force his body to grow at a terrifying rate, his limbs elongating, his frame thickening. Then the process would be reversed, his body breaking down again, as the genitors identified and corrected a microscopic flaw before forcing the growth to begin anew. He was torn apart and rebuilt over and over 100 times, 1,000 times. Any normal human, even a fully grown man, would have died from the shock, their mind shattering into insanity. But the process itself was designed to prevent this. The very bioalchemy that caused the pain also rewrote his brain, his nervous system, his soul, to be able to contain it. He was not being taught to endure pain. He was being physically and spiritually built to be its vessel. After years that were a single unbroken scream of transformation, the process reached a stable point. The vitae womb was opened and a boy stepped out. He was physically the equivalent of a youth in his late teens, though less than a decade had passed since his birth tithe. He was already taller than a normal man, his body, a flawless sculpture of golden brown skin, stretched over a frame of impossible strength and density. His eyes now, a piercing, brilliant gold, held not the innocence of a child, but the ancient, weary gravity of a being who had known only torment. His mind was a blank slate, his personal history a void, but his body was a masterpiece. He was a perfect living vessel forged in a fire that would have turned a star to ash, his soul tempered in an agony that would have broken a god. He was no longer the child of a noble house. He was the raw living material from which a custodian would be made. The forging of a custodian was a holistic process. The body, now a perfect and flawless vessel, was merely the foundation upon which a far more complex structure would be built: the mind. The nameless boy, having emerged from the fire of his biological creation, was taken from the golden cells and brought to a place of quiet contemplation known as the logistai. These were not the noisy, crowded classrooms of a standard schola. These were silent, austere chambers, their walls lined with ancient data slates and priceless works of art, salvaged from the dawn of human history. His new life was one of relentless, all-consuming intellectual pursuit. His tutors, a collection of wizened savants, ancient logisters whose minds were living libraries, and occasionally one of the 10,000 custodians themselves. Their golden armor, a silent, intimidating presence in the quiet halls. His education was designed not to create a soldier, but a companion worthy of the Emperor himself. He was not merely taught tactics. He was immersed in the grandest strategies of humanity's greatest generals, from the Unification Wars to the Great Crusade. He was forced to spend months within sophisticated historical simulations refighting the Battle of Ulanor from the perspective of the Orc war boss, or commanding the doomed fleets at the Istvan V dropsite massacre, forced to analyze every mistake, every failure with a cold and unforgiving eye. He spent years studying the intricacies of diplomacy, learning the 1,000 different dialects of High Gothic, the subtle gestures of the navigator houses, and the complex political structures of 100 different alien races. He was taught to be a statesman, a general, and an ambassador, but his education went far deeper than the practical arts of war and statecraft. He was steeped in the high arts of old Earth. He learned to compose music in the style of the great classical masters, to sculpt stone into forms of breathtaking beauty, and to write poetry that could capture the sorrow of a dying star. He was made to study the works of the great philosophers, to debate the nature of justice, morality, and the human soul with his tutors. The purpose was to create a mind of immense depth and sophistication, one that could understand not just how to protect the master of mankind, but why. He had to understand the beauty of the civilization he was sworn to defend. Woven into this was the litany of the enemy. He was forced to memorize the names, genealogies, and heresies of 1,000 different demons of the warp. He studied the biology of the Tyrannid, the psychology of the Aeldari, and the brutal, simple cunning of the Orc. He was taught to understand his foe in every conceivable detail, for to not know your enemy was a form of unforgivable failure. The culmination of this decade-long intellectual forging came in a final examination, a debate held with one of his primary tutors, a venerable ancient custodian named Diocles. The setting was a simple, unadorned chamber, the two of them seated opposite each other. The topic, Diocles stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held the weight of millennia, is the nature of tyranny. Argue the position that the absolute, unquestioned rule of the emperor is a just and necessary form of it. The boy, his mind now a razor-sharp instrument, did not hesitate. He began to speak, his voice clear and steady. He spoke of the inherent chaos of the human soul, its susceptibility to fear, greed, and the whispers of the warp. He argued that true freedom was a logical fallacy, that a species as volatile as humanity, if left to its own devices, would inevitably descend into self-destruction, as evidenced by the horrors of the Age of Strife. He concluded that the emperor's absolute rule was not a cage, but a shield, a necessary and benevolent act of paternal control that protected humanity from its own worst instincts. It was a perfect, flawless argument, delivered without passion, but with the cold, irrefutable force of a mathematical proof. Diocles listened, his ancient, sorrowful eyes never leaving the boy's face. He probed for any weakness, any flicker of doubt, or misplaced sentimentality. He found none. The boy's mind was a fortress, its walls built from logic and hardened by a decade of relentless indoctrination. "You have learned the lesson," Diocles said, his voice quiet. "You understand the great burden of our purpose." The boy's intellectual forging was complete. He now possessed not just the body of a demigod, but the mind of a philosopher king, a mind perfectly suited and utterly dedicated to the service and protection of his master. Decades had passed since the nameless infant had been taken from his gilded cradle. He was now a man, if such a simple word could be used to describe the demigod he had become. His body was a flawless engine of war, his mind a fortress of strategic and philosophical knowledge. He had survived the agony of creation, he had mastered the crucible of pain, and he had absorbed the wisdom of ages. The final stage of his genesis was at hand. He was brought to a high vaulted chamber known as the Hall of Names, a solemn place where the identities of the 10,000 were recorded. He knelt, his head bowed before a shield captain whose golden armor was adorned with the honors of 1,000 years of service. "You were born of a noble house of Terra." The shield captain's voice resonated, each word precise and heavy with meaning. "That house had a name. That name is Dust. The child they bore is a ghost forgotten by history. Today you are given your true name. It is not a gift, but a burden. It is a legacy of duty you must uphold until your death and beyond. You will be known as Valerius." The name settled upon him not with the warmth of an identity, but with the immense cold weight of a vow. He had no memory of any other name. The boy he had been was so completely erased that he was not even a ghost in his own mind. He was Valerius. That was his first and only truth. From the Hall of Names, the newly christened Valerius was led to the Reclusium of arming. This time there was no crude scout armor. Before him, laid out upon an altar of black marble, was a full suit of golden auramite power armor, a work of artifice so perfect it seemed to hum with its own inner light. Each plate was a masterpiece engraved with the iconography of the Emperor and the intricate scrollwork of the Custodian Guard. A team of robed tech priests and servitors began the long, silent, and sacred ritual of arming him. As each piece of the divine war plate was locked into place, Valerius felt the communion with his black carapace ignite. This was not the simple interface of the scout armor. This was a total fusion of man and machine. The armor was not a shell. It was a second golden skin. He felt its power reserves as if they were his own, its sensory data feeding directly into his consciousness, its immense weight settling upon his augmented frame as naturally as his own flesh. When the final piece, the magnificent eagle-winged helmet with its crimson plume, was locked into place, he was presented with his weapon. It was a guardian spear, a masterpiece of the Great Crusade's artifice. Its haft was a rod of polished adamantium, its blade a shimmering energy-wreathed glaive, and its integrated bolter a compact and deadly instrument of the Emperor's wrath. Valerius took the weapon, its weight and balance feeling not just natural, but as if it were a missing part of his own arm, now finally restored. He was complete. He was no longer a boy, no longer a nameless aspirant. He was Valerius of the Adeptus Custodes, a golden warrior, a demigod forged for the singular purpose of protecting the master of mankind. His first duty was not a glorious battle. There was no horde of Xenos to slay, no heretic fortress to storm. The shield captain who had named him led him from the Reclusium, their golden footfalls echoing in the vast, silent corridors of the Imperial Palace. They walked for what felt like miles through halls decorated with priceless mosaics of forgotten victories and past galleries of silent, dust-covered statues. Finally, they stopped in a long, vaulted hallway, its ceiling lost in shadow, its length utterly and completely empty. "This is the Somnus Corridor," the shield captain stated. "It has not been used in 3,000 years, but a threat could emerge from anywhere at any time. Your post is here." He pointed to a specific spot on the marble floor. "You will stand guard. You will observe. You will not move from this spot unless a threat presents itself. You will not speak unless challenged. Your mind will remain ever vigilant. Your relief will arrive in one standard Terran century." Valerius felt no disappointment. He felt no boredom. He felt only the profound, calming weight of his purpose. He had been forged in the fire of unimaginable pain and educated with the knowledge of ages, all for this silence, for this stillness, for this eternal, unwavering vigilance. "I understand, Shield Captain." His voice, amplified by his helmet's vox, was a calm, steady baritone. The shield captain gave a single sharp nod and departed, his footsteps fading into the immense silence. Valerius moved to his designated post. He planted the butt of his guardian spear on the marble floor with a soft, resonant thud. He assumed the ready stance, his posture a perfect, unbreakable expression of contained power. His helmet's red eye lenses stared down the long, empty, silent corridor. His great war had begun. It was a war not against a physical foe, but against the slow, grinding passage of time itself, a battle that would be fought in the silent, hidden fortress of his own mind for the next 100 years. The century passed. 100 years of absolute, unbroken silence in the Somnus Corridor. For the fleeting lives of mortal men, it was an age, a span of time in which empires could rise and fall. For Valerius, it was his first breath. His relief arrived, another golden giant identical to himself in purpose, and without a word, Valerius was assigned his next post. This was the nature of his existence, the beginning of a vigil that would last for millennia. He became a silent golden statue in the endless sacred halls of the Imperial Palace. a fixed point in the chaotic churning river of human history. He stood guard for 2 centuries at the entrance to the forbidden archives, the air thick with the dust of forgotten knowledge, his presence a silent denial to the curious and the ambitious. He spent 300 years in the Hall of Leng, a vast, dark chamber where ancient, pre-imperial artifacts were kept in stasis, their silent menace a constant low-level thrum against his senses. From his motionless posts, he became the ultimate witness to the slow, inexorable decay of the Imperium. He saw generations of High Lords of Terra pass before him. He would see a man at the peak of his power, his face flush with arrogance and ambition, stride down the hallway surrounded by sycophants. 200 years later, he would see the same man, now a withered skeletal figure kept alive by a web of humming life support systems, being wheeled past his eyes filled with the bitter dust of his failed schemes. Valerius heard the whispered conspiracies of rival factions in the shadowed alcoves. He saw alliances forged and broken. He witnessed acts of petty jealousy and profound betrayal. He observed the slow, cancerous spread of ignorance and superstition through the very heart of the Imperium's command structure. He was a silent, golden ghost, an unnoticed observer in the slow-motion collapse of the civilization he was sworn to protect. But his stillness was a lie. His silence was a facade. Behind the impassive, glowing red lenses of his helmet, Valerius's mind was a raging, unceasing tempest of calculation and simulation. His purpose was not to stand still, it was to be eternally ready. And so his superhuman intellect, a tool forged to comprehend the divine, was turned to the endless, paranoid task of predicting every possible threat. As he stood guard in the Hall of Victories, surrounded by the tattered, glorious banners of 1,000 long-dead Space Marine heroes, his mind was a battlefield. He ran a simulation, a cadre of Eldari harlequins, their movements a blur of impossible acrobatics, emerging from a hidden webway portal behind the banner of the Crimson Fists. He calculated his response time, the optimal angle of his guardian spear's first strike, the precise firing pattern of his integrated bolter. He ran the simulation 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, refining his response down to the nanosecond, until his counterattack was a flawless, perfect sequence of lethal motion. Then he would run another. A Genestealer cultist, their body a grotesque fusion of human and Xenos, crawling from a ventilation duct above. A psychic attack from a hidden Alpha Legion sorcerer, attempting to cloud his mind. A demonic incursion, the very stone of the floorboards weeping blood as reality buckled. He imagined every possible enemy, every conceivable tactic, every angle of attack. He was his own eternal adversary, a grandmaster playing 1,000,000 concurrent games of chess against himself, where every board was a different potential apocalypse, and every move was a matter of life and death. This was the true nature of the Long Watch. It was not a passive guard duty. It was a state of absolute unending and profoundly exhausting mental warfare, a private, silent battle fought for centuries on end, a war against the infinitely branching possibilities of his own singular, catastrophic failure. After 5 centuries of unbroken, motionless vigilance, Valerius was relieved from his post. He was not given a new corridor to guard, but was instead summoned to the Strategium, the tactical heart of the Custodian Guard. A shield captain, his armor bearing the marks of service dating back to the Great Crusade itself, addressed him. "You have learned the art of patience," Brother Valerius, the ancient warrior, stated. "You have proven your vigilance against the slow erosion of time. Now you will prove your vigilance against the blade in the dark. You have been chosen for the blood games." The shield captain gestured to a hololithic map of the Imperial Palace, a construct of light so vast and complex, it was a city in itself. "For centuries you have been the lock. Now you will become the thief. Your duty is no longer to stand guard, but to find a way to break it. You will study our defenses, You will find their flaws, and you will exploit them. Your objective: infiltrate the Sanctum Imperialis and place this marker upon the steps of the Golden Throne itself. He handed Valerius a small golden disc. You will think like a traitor. You will move like an assassin. You will scheme like a demon. For in our failure to predict the actions of one such traitor, we were damned for 10,000 years. We will not fail again. The transformation required of Valerius was profound. For centuries, his mind had been a fortress, its every thought dedicated to the principles of defense and unwavering loyalty. Now he had to tear down those walls and invite the enemy in. He was given access to the deepest archives, the records of the Imperium's greatest enemies. He spent months studying the shadow tactics of the Kalidas assassins, learning how they could change their very flesh to mimic another. He analyzed the teleportation strike patterns of the Night Lords, their use of terror and misdirection. He delved into the heretical texts that described the psychic deceits of the Alpha Legion and the ways in which a demon of the warp could tear a hole in reality to manifest where it was least expected. He had to unlearn what it was to be a guardian and learn what it was to be a defiler. He had to look upon the golden sacred walls of the palace which he had sworn to protect with his life and see only an obstacle to be overcome, a puzzle to be solved, a fortress to be breached. His attempts were a masterclass in failure, each one. A lesson in the terrifying layered perfection of the palace's defenses. He first attempted a physical assault using a rare violent plasma storm in Terra's upper atmosphere to mask his energy signature as he scaled the outermost curtain wall, a sheer mile-high cliff of polished adamantium. He was a phantom, his augmented muscles carrying him with inhuman speed, but his ascent was halted by a web of microscopic invisible laser wires that detected the atomic disturbance of his passing. His second attempt was one of deception. He acquired the identity of a high-ranking Mechanicus adept, his disguise perfect, his forged credentials flawless. He walked through the public areas of the palace, his gait and mannerisms a perfect mimicry. He passed a dozen checkpoints, but as he approached the inner sanctum, a pair of custodian guards simply stepped forward to block his path. They did not challenge his credentials. One of them simply said, "Your heart beats with the rhythm of a warrior, not a scholar. Your path ends here." Their very biology, their superhuman senses had detected the lie. His final attempt was one of desperation and genius. He found it not in a grand strategy, but in a forgotten historical footnote, a sealed, decommissioned sewer conduit that had been used during the Unification Wars, long before the palace had been rebuilt to its current glory. The ancient schematics showed it passing theoretically beneath a disused wing of the Sanctum Imperialis. For weeks he moved through the filth and the dark, a golden demigod crawling through the forgotten bowels of Terra's history. He bypassed 1,000 ancient decaying security systems until he finally founded a single unmonitored maintenance grate that led up into a silent, dust-choked chamber. He had found a flaw, a 1 in a trillion oversight in 10,000 years of obsessive paranoid fortification. He moved like a ghost through the silent corridors, the golden marker in his hand, his two hearts beating a silent, triumphant rhythm. He was only 100 yards from the Eternity Gate itself. As he rounded a final corner, he was met by the sight of 10 custodians, their guardian spears leveled, their red eye lenses glowing in the dark. They had been waiting for him. He had not succeeded in reaching the throne, but he had succeeded in his true mission. In the debriefing, he presented his findings with cold, clinical precision. His successful infiltration was not a cause for praise. It was a source of profound collective shame for the guard. The ancient conduit he had used was sealed with a meter of solid adamantium within the hour. The patrol routes were rescheduled. The auger arrays were recalibrated. The flaw was purged. The blood games were not a game. They were the heart of the Custodes' philosophy, a constant, unending, and ruthless war against their own complacency, a desperate 10,000-year-long battle to ensure that the blade in the dark would never ever find its way to their master again. Millennia turned to dust. The Imperium outside the palace walls continued its slow, grinding decay, but within the silent halls, Valerius endured. He had stood the long watch, his mind a fortress against the erosion of time. He had played the blood games, his spirit a blade honed against the whetstone of his own paranoia. He had become an ancient being, his service record a litany of silent, perfect vigilance. Now, after a span of time that would have seen a lesser species rise to galactic dominance and fall into ruin, he was to be given a new and terrible burden command. In a solemn ceremony in the Hall of Heroes, before the towering golden statues of custodians who had fallen during the Great Heresy, Valerius knelt. The Captain General himself bestowed upon him the rank of Shield Captain, placing a magnificent crimson vexilla, a banner of office, into his hand. The oath he swore was no longer just of personal duty, but of collective responsibility. He was now responsible for the lives and actions of 10 of his brothers, 10 fellow demigods. Commanding a shield company of the Adeptus Custodes was unlike any other command in the galaxy. Valerius was not a general leading soldiers. He was the focal point, the conductor of a small orchestra of 10, of the deadliest, most intelligent, and most individualistic warriors ever created. Each custodian in his company was a master strategist, a hero in his own right, his mind a repository of centuries, if not millennia, of combat experience and philosophical study. They did not follow orders blindly. They followed the strategic vision of their shield captain because their own flawless logic had concluded that his plan was the most optimal. The burden upon Valerius was therefore immense. He did not have to be merely a good commander. He had to be perfect. His every plan had to be a flawless masterpiece of strategy. His every command a stroke of tactical genius, for his subordinates were beings who would instantly recognize anything less. His first test as a commander came not in a true battle, but in a defensive scenario of the blood games. An alert, a simulated demonic incursion, was triggered in a deep, forgotten sub-level of the palace, a relic of the dark age of technology. Valerius and his 9 brothers were the designated response team. The space was a labyrinth of ancient humming machinery and dark, narrow corridors. The enemy was a series of holographic projections and combat servitors programmed to mimic the impossible reality-bending movements of Tzientchian horrors. From his command position, Valerius's mind became a tactical map of the entire engagement. He did not see his brothers. He saw 10 points of golden light, 10 vectors of lethal force that he had to deploy with the precision of a master artist. Brother Diocletian, his voice calm and steady, broadcast over their private voxnet. Your trajectory is suboptimal. Adjust your angle of approach by 3.7 degrees to create a superior crossfire zone. Brother Lycurgus, the enemy's manifestation pattern is a predictive echo. Do not strike where it is, but where it will be in 1.3 seconds. His mind was a storm of calculations, processing a billion different variables at once. He was not just fighting the enemy, he was fighting the specter of failure. He knew that a single miscalculated command, a moment of hesitation, could result in one of his brothers being delayed, their perfect synchronicity broken. In the world of the Custodes, such a flaw was an unforgivable failure, a crack in the golden wall that protected the master of mankind. The engagement was over in less than a minute. The simulated demons were annihilated, their holographic forms dissolving into static, the combat servitors reduced to heaps of twitching metal. The victory was by any standard absolute and flawless. But as Valerius reviewed the after-action report, a process that took place in his own mind, in the space of a heartbeat, he found a flaw. In executing his final command, Brother Diocletian's advance had caused a minor secondary energy cascade in a piece of ancient, irreplaceable Dark Age machinery. The damage was microscopic, strategically irrelevant, but it was an unplanned consequence. It was an imperfection. He stood in the silent humming chamber after the simulation had ended, the weight of his new commands settling upon him like a mountain. The lives of his brothers were his to command, but that was the lesser burden. The true burden was the crushing absolute and eternal weight of the standard. He was now sworn to uphold a standard of nothing less than divine mathematical perfection in a galaxy that was anything but. In the third millennium of his service, Shield Captain Valerius was granted the most solemn and terrible of all duties, to command the vigil at the Eternity Gate. This was not just a strategic location. It was the heart of their shame, the sacred ground of their ultimate failure. The gate itself was a vast, towering portal of fused adamantium and gold, its surface still visibly scarred and blackened from the unimaginable energies that had been unleashed during the final apocalyptic duel of the Horus heresy. The air here was heavy, thick with the psychic residue of that day, a permanent echoing scream of betrayal, agony, and loss that grated on the soul. To stand guard here was not merely a duty, it was a penance, a constant, unending confrontation with the single moment in history that truly mattered, the moment the Adeptus Custodes had failed. Valerius stood his post motionless as a statue, his crimson vexilla held perfectly still. But in the silent fortress of his mind, he was not in the present. His perfect eidetic memory, a gift and a curse of his creation, allowed him to access the full, unedited combat logs and sensory data of the custodians who had stood this very ground 10,000 years ago. He was not just recalling history, he was reliving it. He saw through the eyes of Constantine Valdor, the captain general of that age, as the first wave of traitor legions crashed against their golden shield wall. He felt the desperation, the grim resolve as his ancient brothers fought and died, holding back a tide of demons and madmen. He experienced the psychic shockwave as the arch-traitor, the Primarch Horus, his soul swollen with the power of the Chaos Gods, strode onto the field. His very presence a blasphemy that warped reality. He lived the final terrible moments 1,000 times. He watched as the Emperor, his master, the light of humanity, teleported aboard the traitor's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. He felt the collective agonized frustration of the custodian guard, unable to follow their duty, chaining them to the defense of the palace. He then accessed the sensory logs of the single unnamed custodian who had accompanied the Emperor, the one whose broken body was later recovered. Through this dead warrior's eyes, Valerius witnessed the unimaginable. He saw the final terrible duel. He felt the pain of the Emperor's mortal wounding, a psychic blow that echoed through the soul of every living thing. He saw the final terrible choice the Emperor had to make to obliterate the soul of his favored son. He relived the return to the Golden Throne, the sight of his master's broken, dying body, a sight that had shattered the heart of an empire and condemned it to 10,000 years of living death. As the simulation of the past faded, Valerius was left with the cold, bitter reality of the present. He stood before the gate where it had all happened, and he felt the great, collective shame of his brotherhood. They, the 10,000, the greatest warriors ever conceived, had been present. They had fought with the strength and skill of demigods. They had been perfect, and their perfection had not been enough. This was the terrible central paradox of their existence, the crack in their golden armor. They were flawless beings defined by a singular flawless failure. Their every action since that day, every silent century of their vigil, every blood game, every purged heretic, was an attempt to atone for a sin that could never be forgiven. He stood his silent watch, the immense weight of that 10,000-year-old failure pressing down on his soul, a burden far heavier than his auramite plate or his command. A silent, eternal vow, the unspoken creed of every custodian since the heresy, resonated in his mind. What was broken here can never be mended. What was lost can never be restored. Therefore, nothing else can ever be allowed to break. We stood as the final shield, and the shield failed. Now we stand as the guardians of his tomb, and we will not fail again. We cannot fail again. Ever. The vigil at the Eternity Gate was more than a guard duty. It was a self-inflicted punishment, a constant reminder that for a being whose only purpose is to protect, there is no honor in survival when the one you were sworn to protect has fallen. The duty of the custodian guard was not, and had never been, merely a passive vigil. They were the Emperor's final sanction, his most trusted weapon, and their reach extended far beyond the golden walls of the Imperial Palace. After his long penance at the Eternity Gate, Shield Captain Valerius was summoned to the private chambers of the Captain General. There, in the silent, august presence of the leader of the 10,000, he was given a new and secret duty. He was to become one of the eyes of the Emperor, a select few of the custodian guard who moved unseen through the wider Imperium, their purpose to act as the hidden hand of their silent master. The Inquisition is a hammer. Valerius. The Captain General's voice was a low rumble. It is powerful, but it is unsubtle, and it is slow. Some threats require the scalpel, not the hammer. A cancer must be excised before it has a chance to spread. Valerius's first mission was a study in this surgical precision. His target was the hive world of Vantax, a teeming, polluted world of 1 trillion souls. Deep in its underhive, a charismatic preacher, a man known only as the Voice of the Void, had begun to attract a following. He preached not of the chaos gods, but of a coming age of enlightenment of humanity, casting off the shackles of the corpse emperor. His words, however, were laced with a subtle, hypnotic, and warp-tainted power. The local authorities were unable to contain his growing influence, and the Inquisition was still weeks away from even beginning its investigation. The Custodes, however, saw the threat for what it was, a psychic plague that, if allowed to fester, could destabilize the entire sector. Valerius did not travel in a glorious battle barge. He journeyed in a small, unmarked, and impossibly fast jet-black vessel, a Coronis grav carrier that used ancient, forgotten flight paths to bypass all Imperial Navy checkpoints and auger nets. He did not wear his golden armor of state. Instead, he was clad in dark, nondescript robes and a sin-skin body glove that masked his immense physique and his superhuman energy signature. His guardian spear was disassembled and carried in a plain, lead-lined case. To any observer, he was just another anonymous pilgrim or official, his true nature hidden behind a veil of utter normality. He was a ghost, a demigod pretending to be a man moving unseen through the very empire he was sworn to protect. His arrival on Vantax was a descent into hell. The air was a toxic chemical soup that would have killed a normal man in minutes, but his augmented lungs simply filtered it. He moved through the teeming, desperate crowds of the underhive, a silent, focused predator in a sea of prey. His superhuman senses cut through the chaos. He could hear the frantic, drug-fueled heartbeats of the gangers, smell the desperation and the disease in the very air, and his golden eyes, hidden behind a simple visor, saw the subtle, sickening aura of warp corruption that clung to the followers of the Voice. He moved with a purpose that was terrifying his mind, a tactical map, his every step a calculated move towards his target. He was a scalpel descending into the heart of the cancer. He found the Voice in a vast, subterranean cathedral that had once been a great Prometheum refinery. The preacher stood before tens of thousands of enraptured followers, his voice echoing through the cavern, a hypnotic silver tongue weaving promises of a false dawn. He was surrounded by a phalanx of heavily armed guards, brutal underhive warriors who had sworn their lives to him. Valerius did not wait for the sermon to end. He was a ghost in the shadows of the great refinery's machinery. The fight was not a battle. It was a purge, a silent, brutal equation. He moved with a speed that was a blur to the human eye. The first guard died with a silenced bolt from the reassembled Guardian Spear's integrated weapon before he even knew he was under attack. The next few died from the spear's shimmering power glaive, their bodies falling in neatly bisected halves before they could even raise their weapons. The chamber erupted into panic, but it was the panic of a herd of animals, not a military force. Valerius was a phantom, a golden blur in the dark, and in the space of 10 heartbeats, the entire Praetorian Guard was dead. He stood before the voice, the charismatic demagogue now just a terrified, trembling man, his hypnotic power useless against a being with a will of iron. There were no final words. There was no confrontation. Valerius simply reversed his guardian spear and drove its armored butt spike through the preacher's heart, ending the threat with the cold, dispassionate finality of a surgeon closing an incision. He then melted back into the shadows and vanished as silently as he had come. Weeks later, when the Inquisition finally arrived, they found a cult that had mysteriously and violently collapsed its leader dead from an unexplainable internal wound. There was no trace of Valerius. His success was measured by the fact that no one in the galaxy would ever know that a demigod had walked among them and had for a brief, bloody moment held the fate of a sector in his hidden golden hand. Valerius returned to the silent golden halls of the Imperial Palace as a ghost returns to its haunt. The transition from the chaotic, teeming, and filth-ridden underhive of Vantax to the serene, austere, and impossibly clean corridors of his home was a jarring one. He shed the dark robes of the Eye of the Emperor and once again donned the magnificent golden oromite of his office. He resumed his long watch, a silent, gilded statue, his face hidden behind the impassive death mask of his helmet. But his journey into the wider Imperium had left a subtle, indelible mark upon his ancient consciousness. He had seen the reality of the kingdom he was sworn to protect, and it had planted a seed of cold, bitter irony in the heart of his perfect, logical mind. As he stood his centuries-long vigils, his mind once occupied only with tactical simulations, and the memory of his one great failure was now filled with a new, troubling paradox. He began to compare the two Imperiums, the one he had been forged to serve, and the one that now existed. In the Logistai during his creation, he had been taught of the Emperor's great crusade, of the grand enlightened vision of a secular human empire. That Imperium was to be built on a foundation of reason, science, and the absolute rejection of superstition and faith. It was the imperial truth, a philosophy that sought to free mankind from the shackles of false gods and the tyranny of ignorance. The Emperor he had been taught of was a master of men, a general, a statesman, a being of unparalleled intellect. But he was a man, nonetheless. He was not a god, and he had explicitly forbidden his own worship. But the Imperium that Valerius had just walked through was a grotesque mockery of that vision. It was an empire not of reason, but of blind, fanatical faith. He had seen the ignorant masses, their faces contorted with zealotry, praying to the Emperor not as a founding father, but as a distant, vengeful, and unknowable deity. He had seen the ecclesiarchy, a corrupt and powerful church, preaching a doctrine that the Emperor himself would have condemned as heresy. He had witnessed the Adeptus Mechanicus, the supposed keepers of knowledge, chanting litanies at machines. They no longer understood their fear of innovation, having turned them from scientists into superstitious, dogmatic priests. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was a crumbling, Gothic, and decaying edifice built on the very foundations of fear, ignorance, and religious fervor that his master had sought to obliterate from the galaxy. This was the supreme, agonizing irony of his eternal service. He and his 10,000 brothers were the guardians of the Emperor's body and the keepers of his legacy. Yet, they were forced to stand as silent witnesses to the complete and utter desecration of that legacy. They were protecting an empire that their master, were he to awaken, would despise. They stood guard over a throne from which a religious tyranny was enacted, a tyranny that was the absolute antithesis of the Emperor's dream. Yet their duty was absolute. Their oath was to the master of mankind, and by extension to the Imperium that existed, however grotesquely, in his name. He could see the rot, he could see the corruption, he could see the profound tragic failure of it all. But he could not act. His duty was not to correct the course of the Imperium, but simply to ensure its continued agonizing existence. He was a perfect guardian in a perfect prison, a being of enlightened reason, forced to protect a kingdom of madness. A living testament to a glorious past, condemned to bear silent witness to its slow, miserable, and seemingly endless decay. For all their godlike perfection and the immense isolating weight of their duty, the custodians were not unthinking automatons. They were individuals, each possessing a mind of immense power and sophistication, a personality forged over millennia of silent contemplation and brutal conflict. Their camaraderie was not the boisterous, backslapping brotherhood of space marines in a feasting hall. It was a quiet, solemn, and deeply intellectual bond forged in the silent spaces between their eternal duties. In the rare moments when they were not on active vigil, they would gather in places like the Hall of Solitude, a vast, quiet library within the palace whose shelves held the last surviving copies of the great literary and philosophical works of old Earth. Here, Valerius and the brothers of his shield company would engage in the only true society they had ever known. They were a brotherhood of the lonely, a gathering of demigods who could only ever truly be understood by their own kind. Brother Deocean, a being of pure cold strategy, would often set up a great holographic game of Centurion, a contest of tactics so complex it could take decades to play a single match. His mind saw the universe as a series of tactical problems to be solved, and these games were his way of keeping his primary weapon, his intellect, honed to a razor's edge. Brother Lycurgus, by contrast, was a historian and a poet. He would spend his time in the archives, carefully transcribing the fading epic poems of ages long past, sometimes composing his own somber verses about the nature of their long watch. His works filled with a profound and beautiful melancholy. Their interactions were often debates, philosophical sparring matches between some of the greatest minds in the galaxy. Valerius found himself in one such debate with Brother Cassian, a philosopher whose mind constantly probed the boundaries of their own existence. We are celebrated for our unwavering loyalty. Brother Valerius Cassian stated, his voice a low, thoughtful baritone. But is it truly loyalty? Or is it a form of perfect, unbreakable conditioning? Are we loyal because we have chosen to be, or simply because we were created without the capacity for betrayal? Valerius considered this, his own vast intellect turning the problem over. Does the distinction matter? He countered, if the result is a throne that remains protected, a choice and a command that are one and the same, is the most perfect form of duty. Their debates could last for days, a high-minded exercise that was, in its own way, as rigorous as their combat drills. These moments were the only time they could speak of the burdens that no one else in the universe could comprehend. They could speak of the shame of their one great failure, of the psychic scream that echoed from the Golden Throne, of the painful irony of guarding an empire that had become a grotesque parody of their master's vision. They were the only beings who knew the truth, and they could only share that truth with each other. Their brotherhood was their only sanctuary from the crushing absolute loneliness of their perfection. But these moments were always fleeting. A silent, chiming tone would echo through the hall, a signal for a shift change, a new duty to be performed. And in an instant, the philosophers, the poets, the strategists would vanish. They would rise, their conversations ending mid-sentence, and without a word, they would don their magnificent helmets and retrieve their guardian spears. They would transform back into the silent golden statues of their duty, their brief moment of communion over their individual personalities, once again locked away behind the impassive masks of their office. They would return to their solitary vigils, their brotherhood a brief, warm memory in an endless, cold ocean of silent, lonely duty. After 7,000 years of flawless, unwavering service, Shield Captain Valerius was granted the highest, most sacred, and most terrifying honor that can be bestowed upon a custodian. He was chosen to serve as one of the companions, the 10 golden guardians who stand in a perpetual silent vigil at the very foot of the golden throne itself. His journey to the Sanctum Imperialis was a pilgrimage through the very heart of the Imperium's power and sorrow. He passed through the Great Crusade's gate, through the Hall of Martyrs, and finally through the immense adamantium portals of the throne room itself. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the change was absolute and overwhelming. The air was not air. It was a physical, crushing weight of pure psychic power, a force so immense it made the very atoms of his auramite armor vibrate in sympathetic agony. The chamber was a cavern of impossible scale, its ceiling lost in a cathedral-like darkness. But all sense of space was dominated by the golden throne. It was not a throne of elegant, regal design. It was a monstrous arcane machine, a mountain of baroque gold and platinum intertwined with 1,000,000 miles of humming cables, crackling power conduits, and arcane, barely understood life support systems. And at its heart, almost lost within the colossal web of machinery, was the master of mankind. He was a skeletal, desiccated figure, a corpse strapped to a machine. His ancient, withered face a mask of eternal pain. His body kept in a state of living death by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, whose souls were consumed to fuel the great device. But the sight, for all its horror, was nothing compared to the sound. There was no physical sound, but Valerius's mind was instantly engulfed in a psychic hurricane, a constant, unending, and galaxy-spanning scream. It was the mind of the Emperor, a being of unimaginable psychic power, broken, dying, and held in a state of perpetual agony for 10,000 years. It was not a single coherent thought, but a symphony of 1,000,000,000,000 dying screams, a storm of ancient memories, a battle against the laughing gods of chaos in the warp, and the profound, soul-crushing weight of a father's grief for his billion lost and wayward sons. It was a psychic assault of such magnitude that any lesser being, even a Grey Knight, or the lord of a Space Marine chapter, would have had their mind and soul instantly and utterly vaporized. Valerius took his place at the foot of the throne, his guardian spear planted firmly, his golden armor a tiny defiant point of order in a maelstrom of cosmic divine chaos. His duty here was not just to stand guard against a physical threat. It was to act as a psychic anchor, a spiritual bulwark. He and his 9 brothers had to use their own immense ironclad wills to help contain the storm, to lend their infinitesimal strength to the Emperor's own eternal battle. He stood his silent vigil, and the Emperor's agony washed over him. He was flooded with flashes of memory that were not his own, the sight of stars being born at the dawn of time, the feel of sand on a forgotten Terran desert, the face of a treacherous beloved son raising a weapon against him, the endless grinding pain of a body that was both dead and eternally consciously alive. This was the true long watch. This was the ultimate conversation. It was a one-sided dialogue with a dying god, a vigil kept in the heart of a psychic apocalypse. To endure it for a single rotation was a testament to the custodian's impossible mental fortitude. To do so for a full century, as was his duty, was an ordeal that would leave its mark on even his immortal soul. He stood silent and golden, his own consciousness a tiny fortified island in a raging ocean of divine pain, his every moment a battle to maintain his own sanity against the sorrow of the master he had failed to protect. He was no longer just a guardian of the Emperor's body. He was a silent companion to his eternal torment. 8,000 years. An ocean of time had passed since Valerius had first been given his name. He had stood vigil for longer than most human empires had existed. He had witnessed the slow, grinding decay of the galaxy from the silent heart of its power. He had served his tour in the crucible of the throne room, his mind forever scarred by the psychic agony of his master. He was now one of the most ancient and revered of his brotherhood, his golden armor a testament to an eternity of flawless service. But even for a being crafted for perfection, eternity has its limits. The first sign was not a grand failure, but a flaw so infinitesimally small that no other being in the universe could have possibly perceived it. It came during a blood game of unprecedented complexity. Valerius and his shield company were tasked with repelling a simulated incursion of a lictor brood, their holographic forms programmed with the combat data of 1,000 real-world engagements. The battle was a whirlwind of silent golden motion, a dance of death executed with a grace and precision that was a form of high art. In the final moments of the simulation, Valerius found himself facing the holographic Alpha Lictor. The beast lunged its scything talons aimed at his throat. Valerius executed a perfect, practiced countermaneuver, a spinning block and thrust that he had perfected over 5 millennia of training. His guardian spear lanced out and killed the creature instantly, the hologram dissolving into static. The victory was flawless. The chamber was secured in record time, but as the adrenaline of the simulated combat subsided, Valerius's internal hyper-advanced biomonitors and chronometers presented him with a single damning data point. The neural impulse from his brain to his arm, the signal that had initiated the final killing blow, had an execution time that was 1.37 microseconds slower than his personal peak recorded during a similar exercise 2 millennia prior. It was a delay of just over 1/1,000,000th of a second. It was a flaw so microscopic, so utterly insignificant, that it had no bearing on the outcome. No one had seen it. No one could have seen it. But Valerius knew. The fortress of his mind, which had withstood the psychic scream of a dying god, was shaken to its very foundations by this single, tiny, undeniable fact. He was no longer perfect. To a mortal man, age brings a gentle slowing, a respectable sign of a life lived. To a space marine, it brings a grizzled wisdom that commands respect. But to a custodian, a being whose entire identity, whose very reason for existence, is built upon the bedrock of absolute flawless perfection, any degradation, no matter how small, is a catastrophic failure. A crack had appeared in the flawless diamond of his being. That 1.37 microsecond delay was to his logical and unforgiving mind a betrayal of his sacred oath. What if in a real battle that infinitesimal delay was the difference between a successful parry and a blade finding its way to the Emperor's heart? The possibility was a logical and spiritual poison. He stood in the silent arming chamber after the exercise, his brothers already departing for their next duties. He looked at his own reflection in the polished gold of his gauntlet. The warrior staring back was still a demigod, a being who could slay 1,000 mortal heroes before they could even draw their blades. But in his own eyes he was now flawed. He was compromised. He was a shield with a crack in it, and a cracked shield is no shield at all. The thought once planted began to grow. A custodian does not retire. A custodian does not fade away. He serves perfectly until he can no longer serve perfectly. And then he must find a new way to serve. Valerius looked past his own reflection, his gaze distant, looking at the great sealed gates of the palace. His long watch, his 8,000-year vigil within these golden walls was nearing its end. Not by the command of a superior, but by the cold, harsh, and absolute judgment of his own impossibly high standards. The knowledge of his own imperfection, however microscopic, was a burden that Valerius could not and would not bear in his current role. A shield with a crack is a liability, and the Adeptus Custodes do not tolerate liabilities. After a period of silent personal contemplation that lasted for a standard Terran decade, he made his decision. He presented himself unadorned by his vexilla of command before the tribune of his shield host, an ancient and venerable warrior named Trajan. The chamber was silent, the two demigods facing each other. Valerius did not prevaricate. His words were as precise and as unyielding as his will. "Lord Tribune," he began, his voice a calm, steady baritone. "My internal chronometers have registered a quantifiable degradation in my combat reflex time. The deviation is 1.37 microseconds from my recorded peak performance. While currently negligible, this represents a systemic age-related decline that logic dictates will only increase. I can no longer in good faith claim to be the perfect instrument required for the defense of the Sanctum Imperialis." He paused, the weight of his next words immense. "I formally request to be released from the Long Watch. A more perfect shield must take my place." Trajan listened, his ancient face impassive. There was no surprise, no disappointment. There was only a deep, solemn understanding. This was the way of the 10,000. A custodian's greatest duty was to know his own limits. "Your request is acknowledged." Shield Captain Trajan replied with a slow, respectful nod. "Your 8 millennia of flawless vigilance have been recorded. You are released." The words were a release, but also a judgment. Valerius was no longer a guardian of the inner palace. He took a final, solitary walk through the hallowed, silent halls that had been his entire world. It was a pilgrimage of ghosts. He passed the somnous corridor where a young, newly named custodian now stood, his posture as perfect and as unmoving as Valerius's had been 8,000 years ago. He passed the Eternity Gate, its psychic scar, a familiar, painful ache in his soul. He looked upon the golden walls, the priceless mosaics, the towering statues of his fallen brethren, not as his home, but as a museum of a life he was now leaving behind. Each footstep was a farewell, a silent goodbye to a state of being that had defined him since the moment of his creation. His final destination was the Hall of Armaments, a vast, silent cathedral where the war gear of the Custodes was kept. Racks stretching for miles held thousands of guardian spears, each one a masterpiece of war with a history of its own. He walked to the section designated for his shield company and found the empty space that awaited his weapon. He looked down at the guardian spear in his hands. It had been his constant companion for 80 centuries. Its blade had tasted the foul ichor of demons in the forgotten depths of the palace. Its integrated bolter had purged heretics in the distant hives of the wider Imperium. Its haft had rested on the sacred ground before the golden throne itself. It was not a tool. It was a part of his very being, an extension of his will. With the slow, practiced motions of a ritual he had performed 1,000,000 times, he performed a final maintenance. He polished its auramite casing, consecrated its machine spirit with a final silent prayer, and checked its power cell one last time. Then, with a reverence reserved for the holiest of acts, he placed the guardian spear into its designated rack. The soft click of the magnetic locks engaging was a sound as final as a tomb ceiling. He stood there for a long moment, his hands, for the first time in his long, violent life, empty. The warrior, the guardian, the shield captain Valerius had laid down his arms. He had relinquished not just his weapon, but his very identity. He turned his back on the gleaming wall of golden spears, the symbols of his past life, and walked out of the armory, a nameless, purposeless being, ready to embrace the final, silent chapter of his eternal duty. Valerius, the being who was once Valerius, walked from the Hall of Armaments, his hands empty, his purpose now a void waiting to be filled. He was led to a small, silent, and unadorned chamber, deep within the residential quarters of the Custodes. This was a disrobing sanctum, a place of finality. A team of silent, gray-robed servitors, their movements practiced and reverent, awaited him. This was to be his final disarming, the shedding of the golden skin that had been his identity for 8,000 years. The process was the solemn, quiet reverse of the arming ritual he had undergone as a youth. The servitors began to unfasten the complex latches and power conduits of his auramite armor. The magnificent eagle-winged helmet was lifted from his head, revealing his ancient noble face for the last time within the palace's holy ground. The great, crimson-plumed pauldron, the symbol of his rank as shield captain, was removed. The eagle-emblazoned chestplate which had turned aside the blades of demons and the bullets of traitors was unfastened, exposing the silver and black ports of his black carapace. Piece by piece, the armor that had made him a living icon, a symbol of the Emperor's might, was taken away, until he stood only in his simple black sin-skin undergarment. He was still a demigod, a giant of a man whose body was a flawless sculpture of muscle and scar tissue, a living testament to the lost genius of the Emperor's gene craft. But without the armor, he seemed strangely diminished. A king who had willingly abdicated his throne, a warrior who had laid down his fortress. He stood in the center of the room, a being of immense power, stripped bare. Another figure entered the room. It was an ancient custodian, one so old that his name was only a whisper in the oldest records. He was not wearing gold, but a simple, heavy black cloak, its hood drawn low. He was one of the eyes of the Emperor, the silent, wandering brotherhood that Valerius was about to join. He held a similar black cloak in his hands. He did not speak. He simply held it out. Valerius took the cloak. It was made of a simple, coarse, but incredibly durable material, woven with subtle stealth fibers that would mask his presence from augur scans. He wrapped it around his immense shoulders. The transformation was complete. The brilliant, shining, golden demigod was gone, replaced by a dark, hooded, and anonymous shadow. Then came the final oath. Led by the ancient cloaked custodian, he spoke the words that would be the last he would ever utter within the walls of the imperial palace, a vow of absolute self-annihilation. I who was once Valerius do cast my name into the void, for I am now nameless. I relinquish my rank and my station, for I am now unseen. I renounce my place in the Hall of Heroes, for my deeds, from this day forth, will be unrecorded and unknown. I cast aside the shield and I take up the hidden blade. I cast aside the golden armor and I take up the shadow. My watch does not end. It merely expands to the farthest, darkest star. I will be the eye that does not blink, the ear that does not sleep, the hand that strikes from the darkness. I am the shadow of his will, the silent instrument of his unending justice. He paused, his voice a low, resonant baritone filled with an ancient, weary finality. I am the eye of the Emperor, and my vigil will end only when the stars themselves grow cold and die. With the final word of the oath spoken, a change occurred. His personal records in the great archives of the Custodes were sealed, his name removed from the active roster. To the rest of the 10,000, he was now simply one of the departed. His existence had become a secret. He was no longer Valerius. He was a phantom. The ancient cloaked custodian gave a single slow nod and then gestured to a hidden, unmarked exit in the wall. A secret path that led out into the wider, teeming labyrinth of Terra. Without a backward glance at the golden armor that now stood empty on its frame, the Nameless One pulled his hood low over his face and stepped through the doorway, leaving the silence and sanctity of the palace behind forever. His great static vigil was over. His new wandering and even lonelier vigil had just begun. He was a ghost, leaving his own tomb to haunt a galaxy that would never know his name. Centuries passed. The being who was once Valerius became a ghost, a whisper in the dark corners of the Imperium. He wandered the galaxy, a nameless hooded figure, his face eternally shadowed his purpose, known only to himself. His service continued, but it was a war fought not with legions, but with a single perfectly placed blade, a single whispered word. He averted a civil war on a forge world by presenting its rival Archmagos with irrefutable proof of a shared ancient heresy, forcing them into a pact of mutual silence. He prevented the fall of a sector by assassinating a single charismatic orc war boss before his Wa could ever truly begin his bolt pistol shot. mistaken for a lucky hit from a terrified guardsman. He was the Emperor's will, a scalpel moving through the diseased body of the Imperium, excising cancers before they could be diagnosed. His work so subtle and so perfect that history itself would never know he was there. His long, lonely journey eventually led him to the opulent, decadent hive world of Hydrafur, a major administrative hub and a viper's nest of imperial politics. It was here, while observing the movements of the sector's most powerful noble houses, that his ancient analytical mind detected a pattern, a subtle conspiracy of immense and terrifying scale. A cabal of high-ranking administrative officials, naval commanders, and even a disgruntled inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus had formed a secret pact. They believed the current High Lords of Terra were weak, that the Imperium was rotting from the head down, and they were planning a coup, a swift, brutal seizure of power that they believed would save the Imperium by installing a new, more ruthless regime. The Nameless Ones saw the truth. Their ambition, however well-intentioned, would not save the Imperium. It would plunge the entire segmentum and perhaps the galaxy into a new, bloody age of civil war. He had no army. His oath forbade him from revealing himself or seeking aid. He was the sole instrument of the Emperor's justice. The conspirators were meeting in a heavily fortified spire-top palace, a fortress protected by elite, gene-bulked house guards and a web of state-of-the-art security systems. To any other being, it was an impregnable fortress. To a custodian, it was merely a puzzle. He moved through the city on the night of their secret council, a shadow amongst shadows. He bypassed the energy shields with a piece of Dark Age technology he had carried for millennia. He scaled the sheer, mile-high wall of the spire during a torrential acid rainstorm, his augmented limbs finding purchase where none existed. He was a ghost, a whisper, his every movement a testament to 10,000 years of discipline and skill. He entered the council chamber not with a bang, but with a chilling silence. The dozen conspirators, the most powerful men and women in the sector, were gathered around a hololithic map, plotting their treason. They did not even see him until he was already among them. The fight was not a battle. It was an execution. He moved with a speed that seemed to bend time, his simple, unadorned power sword a blur of silver light. The gene-bulked guards brutes who could tear a normal man in half were dispatched with single perfect strikes, their bodies falling before they could even raise their weapons. The Inquisitor, his mind a fortress of psychic power, tried to unleash a bolt of warp fire, but the Nameless One was upon him before the thought could even fully form his blade, severing the Psyker's head from his shoulders. He was a whirlwind of righteous, silent fury, the living embodiment of the Emperor's judgment. He succeeded. In the space of 30 seconds, the entire conspiracy was annihilated, its leaders a collection of cooling corpses on the floor of their own war room. A civil war that would have cost trillions of lives had been averted. But he was old, even for one of his kind. His reflexes, once flawless, were now merely superhuman. In the final chaotic moments of the fight, the dying naval admiral, in a last defiant act, had triggered a failsafe, overloading the room's power core. The Nameless One was caught in the edge of the blast. The explosion, which vaporized the entire top of the spire, threw him across the room, his ancient body slamming into a collapsing wall. His auramite-laced bones held but something deep within him, some ancient piece of his bioengineered anatomy finally broke. He pulled himself from the wreckage, his body a landscape of pain, a warm crimson wetness, his own sacred blood seeping through his black cloak. He had won. He had performed his final duty. And now he was dying. He stumbled from the ruins, a lone, wounded shadow seeking a quiet, anonymous place to meet his end. The being who was once Valerius stumbled through the rain-slicked, neon-lit squalor of the Hydrafur underhive. He was a wounded giant, his black cloak soaked with his own golden blood, a sight so incongruous in this hellish place that the local gangers and beggars gave him a wide, fearful berth. He did not feel the pain. His mind, the fortress that had endured for nearly 9,000 years, was now systematically shutting down, cataloging its own slow, final decay. He had performed his final duty. The nascent civil war had been averted, trillions of lives had been saved, and no one would ever know. He found a dark, disused alleyway, a space between a failing Prometheum refinery and a crumbling hab block, and collapsed. The reek of chemical waste and human misery was the last scent he would ever know. As he lay dying a ghost in the filth, his mind in its final moments ran its last analysis. He reviewed the data stream of his own life, the agony of the golden cells, the cold logic of the logiste, the 10,000 years of silent vigilance, the terrible beauty of the golden throne, the crushing weight of his one great failure, and this final silent anonymous act. A corrupted data fragment, a ghost of a memory that even the librarians had not fully been able to erase, flickered in his consciousness. The image of a woman's smiling face, a name he could not recall, a feeling of warmth that was utterly alien. Then it too was gone. His two hearts, which had beaten a powerful, steady rhythm for millennia, finally fell silent. A demigod of Terra, a companion of the Emperor, died alone in the gutter, his passing as unnoticed as the falling of a single drop of rain in a planet-spanning storm. Months later, Inquisitor Cassia of the Ordo Hereticus stood in the same spire-top chamber where the Cabal had been slain. She was a woman whose mind was as sharp and as merciless as a power blade, and she was confronted with an impossible mystery. A dozen of the most powerful individuals in the sector, surrounded by an army of elite guards in a fortress that was supposedly impregnable, had all been slaughtered in the space of a few seconds. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, no discernible motive. It was a perfect, impossible crime. For months, she had investigated her every lead, turning into a dead end. But she was relentless. She had retraced the chaos of that night, and her investigation had led her to a single overlooked picked capture from a grimy underhive servitor camera. It showed a tall, hooded figure, clearly wounded, stumbling into a dark alleyway, never to emerge. In that alleyway, amidst the filth and the detritus, her agents found nothing. No body, no weapon. But Cassia, whose eyes were trained to see the infinitesimal, found it herself. Caught on a rusty piece of rebar was a single tiny golden thread woven into a complex knot. It was a paracord bracelet, a simple, worthless trinket. But the thread was not gold. Her auger scanner identified the material as a microscopic filament of pure, flawless auramite. And the knot was not a simple design. It was the Aquilan knot, a symbol so ancient and so secret that its meaning was known only to the highest echelons of the Imperium. Cassia's blood ran cold. She stood up, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She understood. She did not know the how or the why, but she knew the who. She had not stumbled upon a crime scene. She had stumbled upon the final secret resting place of a ghost, a demigod, a being whose very existence was a secret she was not meant to know. Her reaction was immediate and absolute. She returned to her ship, and with her highest authority as an inquisitor, she sealed the entire investigation. She personally deleted every data file. She mind-wiped the agents who had accompanied her to the alley. She purged the picked capture from the cogitator banks. She erased every trace of her own inquiry. She did this not out of fear, but out of a profound, terrifying reverence. The actions of the Emperor's own guardians were not for the lesser servants of the throne to question or to know. A sacrifice of such magnitude had to remain as it was intended, perfect, absolute, and completely unknown. The great tragic truth of the Adeptus Custodes is not found in the glorious battles they have won, for those are but fleeting moments in their endless lives. Their truth is found in the silence that follows. They are the remnants of a golden age, perfect beings forged to be the companions of a living, breathing God, but who are now condemned by their own failure to stand as the eternal, silent wardens of his tomb. They are the most perfect prisoners in the most glorious gilded cage, their immortality, a curse that forces them to bear silent witness to the slow, agonizing decay of everything their master built. They are the living embodiment of a promise that was broken, a dream that died. And when their long, lonely lives finally end, it is not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield recorded by history, but as a silent whisper in the dust, a nameless, forgotten ghost, whose greatest victory and greatest sacrifice is that no one will ever know their name.